Hello, everyone. I hope you're well. This time in Athena Lab, we have the opportunity to talk with Bill Hayton, a renowned British journalist, author of the books The Invention of China and South China Sea, among others. He's also Associated Fellow of the Asia Pacific Program at Chatham House. On this occasion, Bill Hayton will tell us about the main idea of his book, The Invention of China, which I highly recommend. And what we're worried about in the Pacific, the situation of Taiwan, of course. Bill, please, you're very welcome to talk with ThinLab. Thanks for your time and to share your ideas with us.
Great, thank you very much indeed, and thanks to Athena Lab for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to this talk, which is going to focus on the emergence of Taiwan as a place that it was part of the Qing Empire, and then leaves and then comes back. And I want to talk about that process because the history is more complicated than a lot of people make out. So, as you mentioned, this is based on one chapter of my book, for the Invention of China. And in it, I try to show how in lots of different areas, the vision of modern China that we have is a hybrid. It's a mixture of Western ideas of race and nation and territory and some Chinese ideas. And it's about how those ideas were mixed around the late 19th and early 20th century. And my book starts from the understanding that we should look at the country, the state, as it existed at the time, and not in the light of modern ideas. So before February 1912, the political formation, the state that ruled this piece of territory in East Asia was called the Qing Great State, Da Qing Guo. And it was a state that actually had its origins with the Jurchen people who lived up in the northeast of what's modern China, and they took their name the Manchu people, and that state declared itself to be the Qing in 1636, having subdued one group of Mongols. It then invaded Beijing and the rest of China in 1644, expands to include more Mongols, and then expands again into Tibet and Xinjiang in the 18th century. So during this period, you could argue that China, meaning the old Ming state down here, was actually a colony of a Manchurian empire. So what would it mean to be part of this Manchurian empire, this Qing Great State? Well, it was actually a state that based the way that it ruled on Mongol techniques that had been developed in the 13th century. And an author called Pamela Crossley talks about it as using what she calls simultaneous rule. So you had these 5 different areas of the empire. You had Manchuria, you had Mongolia, Tibet, Xinjiang, and then the Chinese area. And each area used a different script, way of writing, and they were ruled in different ways. So all of these groups could coexist within the empire, within the great state, whilst also maintaining their own beliefs, religious beliefs, their own languages, and their own systems of rule. But the Qing state was actually a very divided state. It was almost like apartheid. The cities, and here's a map of Beijing on the right-hand side here, were divided between a Manchu city and a Chinese city. And on the left there, you can see the walls that actually divided the Manchu city from the Chinese city. And this was a feature of pretty much every city in China, that they were divided between Manchu and Chinese. Intermarriage between the two groups was actually banned until 1902. And so the process of China's nation building is really a story of how this Manchu state was turned inside out. Chinese nationalists assumed the right to rule the whole of what was, in territorial terms, really a non-Chinese empire. They assumed the right to decide who was Chinese, how they should speak, and things like that. So how does this affect the history of Taiwan? Well, briefly, and I'm cutting a complicated story quite short here, after the Dutch made an attack and ruled parts of the island of Taiwan in the early 17th century, an independent state was created there, ruled by the Qing family, who were sort of sometimes referred to as pirates or national heroes, depending on your perspective. But they were loyal to the old Ming state, the one that was conquered by the Qing Empire, the people from Manchuria. But they were conquered in 1684 by the Qing, who up until that point really hadn't been that worried about Taiwan, but they recognized that it was a place where pirates could exist and that it would be safer for them if they conquered it and made it a prefecture of Fujian province on the coast. And that's how it stayed for the following 200 years. And then in the context of a French invasion, a war between France and China in the 1880s, it was made a province of the Qing state, but only lasted as a province for 10 years because it was then lost to Japan in the Treaty of Shimonoseki. And I'm going to talk about this period really between 1895 and then 1942-45, when Taiwan is sort of rediscovered, if you like, by Chinese nationalists. So the Treaty of Shimonoseki, and this is a Japanese print sort of portraying Japanese naval officers very in a European way, receiving the surrender of the Chinese side. And this treaty in 1895 was a humiliation really for the Qing Empire. The Chinese side was forced to recognize the independence of Korea, the loss of Taiwan, and had to pay 7,500 tons of silver to Japan. And the treaty ceded Taiwan and the Pescador Islands, which are just off the coast, to Japan in perpetuity and full sovereignty. And just over a month later, the acting governor of the island, who didn't like this arrangement, tried to rebel and created a Taiwan Republic, independent. But it collapsed after just 11 days. And then Japanese forces began to occupy the cities and to crush all resistance to them. And then in the aftermath of this, Qing Chinese officials almost entirely ignored developments on Taiwan. The island was lost, and that was the end of it. And when a leading Taiwan activist went to Japan to meet a leading reformist, a man called Liang Qichao, although he was very nationalistic, he advised his guest not to waste his life opposing Japanese rule, basically saying there was no way the island was going to return to Chinese control. And that was the way it sort of stayed really until the revolution of 1911-12. But even after that, really, there was no change in the status of Taiwan. Both the reformists and the revolutionaries regarded Taiwan as being lost to them. But this whole anxiety about territory, which was partly prompted by the wars with Japan and with France, continues to exist in the Republic of China after the 1911-1912 revolution. And you can see this in the Constitution. So the 1912 Constitution specifies that the territory of the Republic consists of 22 provinces, plus Inner and Outer Mongolia and Tibet. Now, the choice of 22 there is really significant because Taiwan was the 23rd province. This is clearly in 1912, the Republic saying it doesn't lay a claim to Taiwan. Now, this is, even at the time, Outer Mongolia and Tibet had broken away from the Republic, and yet this claim in the Constitution, includes them and says they are part of China, even though they've actually physically broken away. Whereas it's not making a claim to Taiwan, which has been lost permanently. It would suggest. And this anxiety, this, by the way, is we think it's the first constitution in the world that specifically lays out the area of the state in part of the constitution. And the discussion actually goes backwards and forwards. There are some arguments between different forces within China, which I won't go into too much. But this anxiety about the shape of China and where its boundaries lie, was a main feature of discussions in the 1920s and 30s. And you had examples like this from a school textbook where teachers are trying to show children that the shape of China is natural, just like the shape of a begonia leaf here. It's sort of symmetrical. And what you can see here, obviously, is that Taiwan isn't part of this this picture, whereas Tibet and Outer Mongolia are. And this anxiety about territory went into the 1930s, and we can see this in the attempt to draw a new atlas of China by a newspaper called the Shunbao in 1920. And they decided they would have an expedition to visit the frontiers of China, but then they realized there were no accurate maps of the frontiers. And you can see in the front part of the atlas, there's an account of a meeting where they realize they haven't got a complete map of the country. So they intend, instead of having an expedition, they decide to produce a new map instead, which is only produced in 1936. And as you can see, it colors in considerable detail the areas which the Chinese state thinks belongs to them, including these areas like Outer Mongolia and Tibet, which were not under their control at the time. And yet Taiwan here, for example, is not colored in. It's treated the same as, say, Korea or Japan. So what I'm saying here is there's no attempt to assert that Taiwan belongs to China, even in a sort of philosophical sense. It's basically it's lost, and that's the end of the discussion. And this is not just the nationalist or the government position. We can see this in the communist position too. So when the Communist Party drafted a constitution for its republic in 1931, it drew a clear distinction between the Chinese, if you like, and people like Koreans, Taiwanese, Annamese, meaning Vietnam. So Taiwanese here are listed as a separate category of people. In 1938, about a year after the Japanese had really started to invade Taiwan, invade China, the Communist Party puts out a political statement, and it talks about a united front between the Chinese and the Taiwanese people, putting the Taiwanese in the same category as Korean. And these are the glamorous young men who were responsible for that, including Mao down here, 1938. Even when the Communist Party declared war on Japan in 1941, they talked about the people of Taiwan as different from the people of China. The Republic of China's own declaration of war on the same day was significant because it renounced the Treaty of Shimonoseki. It renounced all the treaties between China and Japan, including the Treaty of Shimonoseki. But this wasn't specifically because of Taiwan. It was because the treaties were felt to be unfair on a number of levels. So this wasn't specifically an attempt to reclaim Taiwan more than to sort of end this period of domination by Japan. Three things, I would say, changed around this time. Firstly, because the United States entered the war because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, it became impossible to imagine the defeat of Japan. Secondly, the Chinese leader, Chiang Kai-shek, was looking for ways to divert Japanese war efforts and he was going to promote unrest in areas under Japanese military control, including Taiwan. And then thirdly, and perhaps most significantly, a small number of Taiwanese who had already fled Japanese colonialism were actively lobbying the Kuomintang, the KMT, Chiang Kai-shek's political movement, to start to think of Taiwan as part of China. This was by no means a mainstream opinion. It's very much a minority view. But dozens of small Taiwanese organizations had formed in China during the 1920s and 30s, but they only began to get influence after the start of the war. And because a lot of them spoke Japanese, because they had grown up in Taiwan under Japanese occupation, and a lot of them had been trained, for example, as doctors, they were quite influential within the Kuomintang. One of whom was this man, Wang Junming, who was another doctor, and he forms an organization, the Taiwan Revolutionary League, which becomes recognized by the Kuomintang, the KMT. And then it's in this time, in early or sort of mid 1942, that the Kuomintang starts to talk about Taiwan rejoining China, and it really uses the term retrocession or guangfu, an old word which had been used in the Tang Dynasty time. And this was seen as a big sort of propaganda boost for the Kuomintang. But it's interesting that this wasn't assumed to be a kind of natural process. The Kuomintang, the KMT, had to make a case, and they had to, argue that it was there was sort of racial solidarity, that the Taiwanese are part of the Han people, about history, about the illegitimacy of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, and they claimed that the Taiwanese people wanted to be part of China. So they had to make a case. It wasn't assumed to be obvious from the outset. So really, it was 1942, I would argue, that Taiwan becomes Chinese again, psychologically. The people in China start to think of Taiwan as being part of China again. I'm talking about the sort of the nationalists, the elite level people. Chiang Kai-shek himself started writing his book, China's Destiny, in November 1942, with the help of ghostwriters, one of whom was a leading geographer called Zhang Qiyun. And the book addresses the question of national defense. And it says, and this is a quote from the book, even if one area is occupied by a different race, then the entire nation and the entire state loses the natural barriers for self-defense. Therefore, Taiwan, the islands, Penghu, the Pescadores, 4 northeast provinces, Inner and Outer Mongolia, Xinjiang and Tibet, are all strongholds for the protection of the nation's survival. Now, it's interesting here that he's a kind of chauvinistic view of territory here, that in order to defend China, and it seems to hear that what he's thinking about is the old Ming Empire, the sort of central parts, then China needs to hold on to the surrounding areas in order to defend China, regardless of their ethnic composition. So it appears that during 1942, Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang and their advisors began to think about Taiwan as a defense against foreign invasion, and also as a sign that they were ending the previous century or so of humiliation by the foreign powers. And Chiang Kai-shek also began to press for other territories to be returned to the Republic. He lobbied Indian nationalists to get their support for his claim on Tibet. And also, he wanted to get Hong Kong back from the British. Now, this alarmed the British, Winston Churchill in particular, and they weren't prepared to concede Hong Kong, and they wanted to keep Tibet as a sort of independent buffer state. But they were willing to see Japan give up Manchuria and Taiwan. And so this compromise was sealed at the Cairo Conference in 1943, and it was agreed that China would get Taiwan and Manchuria back, but no mention was made of Hong Kong. And so this comes to pass in 1945, 2 years later, when the Japanese surrender and Kuomintang KMT forces arrive on the island in October. But that said, there were many people on Taiwan who did not wish to be part of China. Some objected to the Kuomintang themselves. Some had started to feel quite independent anyway. And this exploded in February 1947 when there were protests which were met with extreme violence. By the end of March, at least 5,000 people on Taiwan had been killed by the mainland forces. And all this undermined the nationalist proclamations of unity that had justified the return, if you like, of Taiwan to Chinese rule. Nonetheless, within 2 years of these protests, the island became critical to the survival of the Kuomintang. As the Communist Party gained the upper hand in the Civil War, Chiang Kai-shek thought about how he was going to survive, and he turned to his geographical advisor, Zhang Qiyun, the guy who'd helped him with his book, China's Destiny. And Zhang said that what they needed was a place that was sufficiently far away, but would have economic resources that the government could make use of and survive. And so actually it was this guy, Jiang Qiyun, who recommended that Chiang Kai-shek choose Taiwan as his base. And so Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang fled to Taiwan in 1947, so in 49. They established the Republic of China government there and made the island a bastion of an alternative China. So that really is the quick version, if you like, of how Taiwan was sort of lost to China in 1895 and then returns later. But it's not a simple process. It requires a whole change of imagination and thinking about Taiwan. And we see a lot of the legacy of that period in Taiwan's internal politics today, and therefore its relationship with the mainland, with the People's Republic of China. So I'll leave it there, and then we can draw out maybe some of the conclusions and implications of that in our chat.
Well, thanks, Bill. It was amazing. You show us a lot of historical evidence about the situation of Taiwan during a lot of years. But in your book, in part of your book, in the conclusion, I'm trying to know the. I'm trying not to do a spoiler, but you say in one part, evidence play a subordinate role to emotion. We're still living with the impact of those emotional claims. To say the claims about Taiwan from China, from mainland China, are part of an emotional claims or a strategic claims?
Well, I think they mix both. The appeal to nationalism is very much an emotional claim, and applies, I think, to the South China Sea and to other places as well. The idea that to belong to the nation, you must feel the loss of this land, and it's a way of showing your commitment to be very angry, if you like, about the loss of this territory. And this was something that goes all the way back to the 1920s, when the Kuomintang, the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, they deliberately set out to make the population feel angry about the loss of territory. And so things like that school book, which I showed one page from, they were an important way of showing people that they were part of a Chinese nation that had been wronged by the foreign powers, by Japan and Britain and France and so on, and that therefore they need to pull together and become Chinese. And so it wasn't a natural thing. It was a deliberate attempt to create national feeling by creating an emotional connection. And another example is you see lots of these what are called maps of national humiliation circulated around schools and in newspapers, where people were told about the land that they had lost. And these maps get bigger and bigger over time. So they, 1910s, they're quite small. They just say maybe Hong Kong has been stolen. But by the 1930s, they're sort of saying, the Chinese empire used to be so big, it used to include Afghanistan and Iran and big parts of Russia. And, and basically, we've all been humiliated. So we should all stand together. So that's very important. This emotional claim, I think, is really important to understand China's behavior. But obviously, in our modern times, the geopolitics of Taiwan is really important. If you look at a map of the Pacific, you'll see that there's a whole line of islands, the island chain, starting with Siberia up in the top and then going through Japan, and then the Ryukyu Islands, Taiwan, and then down to the Philippines and so forth. And they enclose the Chinese coast, if you like. And so obviously if Taiwan returned to Chinese rule, then China for the first time, since 1949, if you like, would have an outlet directly facing the Pacific. And so it would really change the strategic situation in the western part of the Pacific there, if Taiwan became part of the People's Republic of China.
How important, in your opinion, for Xi Jinping project, to take control of Taiwan in order to restore China's historical international status?
I think it's really very important for Xi Jinping to do this. He talks about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. I mean, and Xi Jinping and the Communist Party, they talk in big slogans a lot of the time. We're seeing common prosperity is one that's being used at the moment. And internationally, they talk about a community of a shared future. And a lot of these phrases are not exactly spelled out as to exactly what they mean. But national rejuvenation seems to be a way to describe the sort of the end of national humiliation, this century from the Opium War of 1840 up to the victory of the Chinese communists in 1949. And the idea is there's a few little bits of outstanding business still to be sorted out. You know, Hong Kong and Macau have been returned to China, but there are still some disputes in the Himalayas with India, plus the South China Sea and the East China Sea disputes, and Taiwan is the big one. And so, in a sense, among a lot of observers, that Xi Jinping wants Taiwan returned to China to PRC or put under PRC control before the 100-year anniversary of the revolution. So that would be 2049, and that it wants to do this. So that would, you know, in the next, you know, sort of 25 years or so, and that time is on its side. China will get gradually more powerful, and Taiwan will be unable to resist being incorporated into the People's Republic.
Do you foresee the possibility of a conflict soon? Because every time we're receiving the news from that region, the news say that air incursions, bad bombers, bad aircraft, ships or warships passing through the channel between the mainland China and Taiwan. Also, the former Indo-Pacific, U.S. Indo-Pacific commander said an invasion to the island is so, it could be imminent. I mean, he said in the 2027, that soon.
Right.
Do you think it's a possibility? Because could be.
Well, I mean, I have heard, you know, maybe from some American observers, this idea that, you know, it took China 20 years from the Tiananmen Square killings in 1989 up to the Olympics in 2008. You know, the country was a pariah and internationally isolated in 1989, and then the whole world came to celebrate in 2008. That took 20 years. So if the same thing was going to happen again, you know, and what they want the whole world to come and celebrate in 2049. So, you know, 20 years before that makes it 2028. So that's kind of, you know, that I think maybe explains some of this thinking about, you know, why it's so urgent that, you know, there's a belief that if China was to do something that would be internationally condemned, like invade Taiwan, well, 20 years later, everything would be forgotten. I don't know whether that forms any part of Chinese thinking or not. But it's clear that China is trying, or the mainland, the PRC is trying to put a lot of pressure on the Taiwanese leadership and the Taiwanese people by displays of military force, by threats of invasion, by saying that if the country declares independence, then there would be a war. I mean, this doesn't, I think, necessarily mean that China is. I don't think it means that China's going to invade, you know, in the next, you know, few years, because I think they would much rather take control in a more subtle way through sort of a mixture of threats and inducements, and that they recognise that they could, you know, they could lose potentially if there was a war. I don't think that would, even if they lost, I don't think that would mean that they would lose the desire to retake Taiwan at some point in the future. But I think they would like to do so in a way that had everybody sort of smiling and, you know, accepting it, and accepting it, maybe not smiling. The problem, of course, is that, you know, the examples that we have of Hong Kong, you know, is that China wouldn't respect any sort of commitments that it might make there. And this obviously makes people on Taiwan feel very nervous. In terms of a lot of the recent flights and things that have been happening, I think they were happening at a specific time of year for a reason. That was the beginning of October, is when the People's Republic of China celebrates the revolution of 1949, and the Republic of China on Taiwan celebrates the start of the nationalist uprising of 1911. So you have these two rival national days that take place within 10 days of each other at the beginning of October. And so I think that was a sort of it was a particularly emotional time, for both Chinas, if you like. And so that was a kind of, a time when tension was high. And it's interesting, it's important to remember that although Chinese, as in mainland, communist planes were flying across the halfway line and they were entering Taiwan's air defense identification zone. So we're saying that isn't a legal thing that they're violating there. Taiwan declared this ADIZ, air defense identification zone, and this median line between the two that's supposed to exist. But these are not sort of internationally legal things. So technically, China isn't breaking international law by what it's doing, but it clearly has a political purpose, which is to intimidate.
And finally, do you see a tendency from different actors in the international community to normalize their relationships with Taiwan? In the last few weeks, I saw many Taiwanese diplomats talking with their counterparts in the European Union, in different countries. Everyone is celebrating Taiwan's performance against COVID, the pandemic. So do you see this tendency?
Well, I think we're seeing a series of actions and reactions here. And China diplomatically has been playing a very poor game, really. It's irritated some countries in Europe, and that's led, for example, Lithuania and the Czech Republic in Central and Eastern Europe to improve their ties with Taiwan against China's wishes. China's behavior during the pandemic, when supply chains were disrupted and various other things, and its behavior in Taiwan in Hong Kong, has made a lot of European leaders much more worried about China than they were before. And so if you look at the new EU Indo-Pacific strategy, a lot of it is about diversifying supply chains, moving away from China where possible so that there are other options. And that EU strategy talks about Taiwan as a partner several times in a way that it might not have done only a couple of years ago. So yeah, you get the feeling that there is an attempt to both support Taiwan and to integrate Taiwan more into European thinking. And clearly something similar is going on in the US. We're seeing much more open acknowledgement of the fact that there have been military trainers in Taiwan from the United States, for some time. And so I think the problem here is that both sides are kind of upping the ante. And so as China makes a threat, so other countries are trying to emphasize how much they will protect Taiwan, either formally or informally. And that kind of makes the Chinese more anxious, and then it makes everybody else more anxious. And so we're getting into a much more confrontational situation. And I think actually one of the problems, about me talking about this history that I've explained out today, is that will create different understandings of the history on both sides of the Taiwan Strait between Beijing and Taiwan. And so people on Taiwan might think, well, yeah, it's obvious that, for a century between 1895, or more than a century between 1895 and today, we've only been part of China for those 4 years between 1945 and 1949. Whereas, of course, that's not the view of history that's taught in China. And so that kind of justification for Chinese behavior and threats is much stronger, obviously, in the mainland. And so you have these two different views of the world, inside the People's Republic and outside the People's Republic. and I think that, does make confrontation more likely.
Perfect. Well, Bill, thanks for your time, for this opportunity to talk with you about your book, and for sure your interesting ideas and achievements. We really recommend this book. It's not in Spanish still.
One day soon,
Maybe we can do something. So good to see you, Bill, and let's keep in contact soon. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Great pleasure to talk to you all.
Bye. Thank you, Bill. Bye, everyone.